The topic is obviously punishment. So I know you guys have had a discussion over what you want to talk about and where you want to take things, but I think it's probably worth having an initial talk about what exactly we mean when we say punishment. So Daniel, why don't you kick us off with that?
It's funny, when I first thought about the topic, I was like, oh yeah, punishment, that's a pretty straightforward concept. And then the more you think about it, and then the more you think about coaching, there's such a fine line between almost punishment, firmness, sort of asking athletes to meet expectations. And I think where we got to in the discussion was that let's almost shelve the idea that at no point is sort of abuse or attacking or abusive, like physical behavior or verbal behavior appropriate. So let's take that off the table as though that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about punishment and negativity. That's inappropriate. And then you sort of move on to this spectrum almost of, I guess it's a spectrum of negativity to positivity, but perhaps it's even more nuanced than that, where almost punishment can sometimes be seen as almost firmness or something like that. And maybe that's where we sort of almost need to start our discussion around, Sean, what do you think punishment is? Is it as simple as just negativity, or where are we going here?
Well, I think if you could put things in a simplistic term and, kind of just put it in one realm, that would be great. But I think there are so many broad spectrums to that. And I think every coach at every level really looks at, I guess, if you're using that word punishment differently. Some people might use it for, trying to correct. Some people might use it more in the conditioning realm as to, okay, well, let's make it volleyball related, but somehow get our athletes better conditioned. There's the on-court versus on or off-court functions as well. Is there a punishment for breaking a team rule versus not doing well, on the court skill-wise? So this really could, get morphed into a lot of different areas and go a lot of different ways. But I thought, when you and I have talked, the other day, but then also previously, we've had a lot of good discussions, talking about my background and how I've evolved as a coach. And, I think I started off in my younger days, certainly as a coach that really was more on the punishment side when things didn't go well and things get perceived as negative a lot of times, especially when you start to raise your voice. And maybe raising your voice is just trying to get your point across, but a lot of times things get viewed as, well, that's negative, and then you do roll into that punishment side of things as well. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can go here.
So, Coach, I mean, you just spoke about that sort of where you started. I mean, do we think that negativity or yelling or punishment is almost the norm, or where sort of practical coaching has come from? Is that, like you spoke about, that's where you started? Why did you start there?
I think a lot of it was just groomed in how I was coached in various sports growing up, especially in the 80s and the types of coaches that I had. And then I think when you reevaluate and you look back and see the different coaching styles you had, sometimes you just naturally emulate those. But then, I look at some of the most successful teams that I've been a part of, and those coaches were not your, I guess, quote unquote, screamers and yellers, but more of the problem-solving type of coaches that helped you work through those moments and didn't utilize it as punishment, but as learning tools and learning times, I guess.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I know in my case, your default mechanism is what you experienced yourself, because you don't necessarily know any different. It's like, hey, this is how we do it. And, call it fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to, kind of qualify it. We have a coaching structure that kind of goes back to a quite militaristic type of approach, command and control, top-down authority type system. And in the military, if you screw up, you're generally punished in some way. Yeah. It's physical punishment, it's extra duty, it's whatever. You name it. I've been through it. I was in the Army for a bit. But the thing that I would also toss out there is that, unfortunately, punishment is also an easy default. So it's almost a lazy thing, because you can think of better alternatives. But if it's right there because either you've done it before or you've seen it done before, it's the quick and easy thing to automatically do in a situation where maybe you have to make a quick decision.
And I think that also sort of goes in with the, as Sean was mentioning, the raising of the voice and the yelling. When you're in a pressure situation and you don't have a solution, or you feel like an athlete's not listening, or you're not getting the change you want, instead of almost rethinking what message am I giving, you naturally almost just give the same message harder or more or like again because you assume that they just haven't heard or haven't listened. So I think that's also where the sort of yelling comes from, that you just like, you want this person to listen and to take this information so badly, and that, this needs to happen right now. And the easiest way that we default to doing it is just by sort of talking louder.
Yeah, and I think things like that, certainly they can escalate. And, I talk a lot in the recruiting process about that aha moment with athletes, and, you're trying to guide them and, get them to discover things on their own versus it always being coach-based. And, you want things to be player-driven and that exploration. But, I know with my first collegiate head coaching job, I was coming from Ohio State University and, getting into Sweet 16s and coaching as an assistant at a high level, then taking over a program that was vastly different, not as successful. And I kind of became a coach trying to win and trying to get things done in a very quick manner that really wasn't me. And, thankfully I had some good players, some good student athletes at the time that were able to communicate with me and just kind of go, this isn't who we know, and I kind of let my, personal lifestyle in terms of fitness and things get out of control. And so I was coaching in a way where I was really that screamer and yeller. And finally, even my wife just goes, hey, that's not who you are. And, for me to kind of take that step back and go through some self-analysis, which is very tough to do sometimes, really help kind of shape my future coaching style, so to speak. But, I've really figured out the more you yell, the more the players are going to tune you out. And you might get a quick temporary fix, but the more it's just from the coach, and the louder you get, the more they just start, to me, tuning those things out and really kind of reverting or almost going the opposite way.
Right. Yeah, we've got a question from Michael asking, can physical punishment be a quote-unquote gateway drug to abusive behavior by youth coaches? And can some coaches use intimidation and fear to stop kids from speaking out? Yes, it's obviously they can. The gateway drug, that's an interesting idea, and I would imagine that for some coaches, you would have to say that's probably true.
I mean, if something's going wrong, it's such an easy solution to say, go do some laps or do some push-ups, because that sort of gets you away from me and sort of almost gives me time to think. And I guess almost sort of like it's like a really easy, just like, okay, here's my easy solution. Just go away, do some physical stuff, and we'll, like just leave me alone almost. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah, and I think there's that concept. I think you have the concept as to, if we just take the athlete's mind off of what they were doing, then maybe that allows them a break, so to speak, as well. And so I think coaches view it, differently, as to maybe just try to snap them out of whatever pattern they're in at that moment. And then, okay, hey, let's go take a lap and give it some thought as you're taking that lap, and come back, and then let's be ready to start again. That's certainly one way to look at it, versus the coach just kind of going, oh man, I need this break right now. So
it's interesting you say that, because I've seen that physical punishment be used, and you mentioned it right at the start, Sean, that using it as a punishment I've seen the physical punishment stuff as a tool for failing in a skill task, and and instead of just as a behavior modification tool, right?
Yeah.
And I guess an interesting question would be, some people would argue that by putting that physical punishment there, it's like increasing the pressure in the task. but in the same time, it also restricts I guess, the learning ability or the capacity to try things in training. Any sort of thoughts on that sort of idea?
Yeah, I think certainly with the ability to, I guess, hamper the learning process, you're going to get results, maybe with that punishment of getting them better conditioned, or, they're maybe getting stronger or something. But at that point in time, you've taken that focus off of the volleyball or the skill realm, or even the volleyball IQ, to where they're maybe not even thinking about that at all. So I do think that, it's intended different ways, and sometimes you might have to pick and choose the right timing for things. And, if the team is not, let's say, conditioned, and all you're trying to do is just work on volleyball conditioning, is it really a punishment, or is it just, this is where we are and what we need to do to get to that next level?
Yeah. For me, there's the question of, you brought up the idea of a failure of skill execution. So that's introducing the idea of the fear. I'm trying to avoid being punished instead of necessarily trying to do what I'm supposed to be doing, as you said, whatever your focus is supposed to be. And the other element of it is, punishment for losing, which has always struck me as a difficult link for me to see. If a player is going to be competitive, they're going to be competitive, not because they're afraid of running. That's just going to introduce some other factors. You want them to be competitive for competitive sake, not because they're afraid of something else. So I never saw that as being particularly constructive.
Such a football mantra, isn't it? Oh, we lost on Saturday. Monday's going to be a tough physical day, or Tuesday's going to be, the coaches are going to rip into us on Monday or Tuesday.
And I think you see that in that thought process is out there a lot. And we talk a lot, in our gym about good air, bad air. We want you to try to do things that, maybe are not as comfortable, and we're okay with, just because you hit a ball out of bounds, you're not running a set of lines or sprints or something like that. If you continue to do things, the same way and aren't trying, then we need to have a discussion as to, okay, what's the disconnect versus jumping right into, well, you're going to do 25 push-ups because you hit 3 balls out of bounds. But, I think you have to be able to have players make errors and, understand what that looks like, and then also understand what the finished product that you're trying to get to looks like. And hopefully, again, with your coaching styles and abilities, you're being able to guide those players to that end result, but then also have them be part of that process of learning as well.
John, I can't stop thinking about what you're talking about that punishment for losing. And is that almost like an ego thing from a coach, where if you guys had just worked harder, I set you up to win and my game plan was fine, and that's why we lost? That's
potentially one side of it, yeah. I mean, and I'm thinking of it, I hadn't really thought of it in terms of like a match or a game context. I was thinking about it more in terms of like a practice contest where, whoever wins this game to 10 points. But it brings up, kind of ties in with what you're just saying, is like, well, you automatically know you're going to punish half the team. So is that a good situation to be in? That you're setting forth, okay, somebody's getting punished. No matter what happens, no matter how well you play, somebody's getting punished today, at the end of this game.
Yeah, and you might have one of the best, let's say, 6-on-6 drills of your season, but you've already predetermined that outcome, as you're saying, for half the team at that point in time. But maybe you literally had the best volleyball from 12, plus athletes out there, but it's hey, we're going to go ahead and do this because these 6 or 8 or whatever lost. So that is, I think, an interesting concept, because you could have literally good results even on both sides, because there is going to be a winner, there is going to be a loser. We all hope we've recruited competitive student athletes for our programs, but everybody's going to compete and view that at different levels, I guess.
Yeah. And to your original point, Daniel, yeah, I mean, the idea of punishing a team for losing, it's kind of along the lines of screaming at a team for losing. It strikes me as it's more of an emotional response from the coach than, and a lack of acceptance of potential culpability on their part. Well, maybe you just didn't prepare your players well enough, or you demotivated them in some fashion, or didn't put your lineup in the optimal way, whatever might have led to, the negative outcome. But there's also just, random chance. I mean, sometimes good teams lose.
So, I mean, I sort of see, when I generally watch sport and watch coaches, I tend to think that yelling on the sideline shows, I see that as a negative thing, that that's not a functional tool. And it almost shows like a lack of ability to sort of, to me, control your emotions and sort of continue to communicate or deliver messages in a practical way. But when Coach Sean and I were talking, you suggested that there's appropriate times to yell during a game.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly times, and when, again, we talk about yelling, how is that perceived, and what is the message? I think that you have coaches that, will yell at, individual players and trying to get their attention, or trying to get them, maybe out of what they're doing at that time, or to think about something different, or going about things a different way. I think you have coaches that will inevitably, yell at officials, trying to get the spotlight maybe off the performance of the team or individual players at that point in time. So you have that. And then you have ones that are, naturally loud, that maybe they're in an arena environment where it's tough to convey that information, and you're having to yell to get information in from there. But I think in general, yelling is perceived as negative, and in a negative style of coaching. I do think that there is that. I think, Daniel, you and I talked about that short-term effect of, I can get somebody's attention, and if it's, louder than normal, then, maybe it kind of catches their attention a little bit more, versus if it's prolonged and I'm continually doing it, then I get tuned out as a coach and nothing gets through or across to the athlete.
Right. Yeah. Selective usage. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing the situation, but also, making sure that if you do have to yell in a situation, that you're not taking it beyond the need to make a point. It's not abusive. It's not violent in nature. It isn't necessarily angry. This is the reality of the situation. This is what we need to do. Bang. Okay. It's out there. It's over. Let's go. Whereas, like you say, if it's sustained, or if there's a fear element that you're driving because you're being really physically aggressive about it, then okay, it's probably not going to work the way you want it to.
Right.
That physical element's really important too, right? That yelling with a different body language can be seen as depending on the body language you use to accompany that voice, the yelling can be perceived completely differently, right?
Yeah, and I've seen the same coach in the same match yell and be very positive as to, you're the best player in the gym, you're going to make this play, but with also the same voice maybe to the same or another player that, that wasn't good enough, that was terrible. And, so you've got that whole spectrum. And then I think what you just touched on, Daniel, in terms of the body language and what's the consistency that you're putting out there with your body language, because I think that can be telling in terms of negativity as well. You've got, coaches, and myself being one, that stands, for the better part of a match, versus sometimes you have coaches that are very into the match, and then when things aren't going his or her way or the way they think the team should be performing, maybe they just go sit down and they become, more reclusive and they don't really communicate with the team and they just sit there. And so that body language says something without even yelling. or maybe there's a timeout occurring and that coach just hands off the team to the captain or to assistant coaches, and they sometimes even I've seen remove themselves completely from that communication with the team. So that, right there says, okay, well, hey, the coach has essentially given up.
Yeah. Actually, when I was coaching in Sweden, I've told this story before. I was watching a match that the second team in the club was playing because I was coaching the first team, and they were playing against a team that was better than them. It was, everybody knew that they were the better team, but our team came in pretty fired up and got on top quickly. And there was a lot of energy. The coach was really energetic, enthusiastic, cheering them on. And then inevitably, as these things happen, the better team started to turn the tide and things started dropping off. And the coach slowly degraded his energy level and then eventually was over at the bench. I don't remember if he actually sat down, but he certainly was not saying anything anymore. And I just remember looking at that going, he's just telling every kid on his team that he's quit on this game. Maybe not on the match overall, but certainly on this game, he's given up, which is just a horrible indication. And you have to know that your players are picking this up from you.
It's interesting you say that. So when I did some communication analysis with Mark Lebedew for his coaching, we sort of measured how much he spoke and how long he spoke for across a training session. And we had this sort of low amount and then sort of a high amount in the middle and then a low amount sort of in the end as you went through each drill. And I remember talking to him and saying, you in my sort of scientific way or analysis, I suggested that he spoke too much in these middle periods, that there was too much communication, that it wasn't functional. He sort of gave me the practical answer, which was I deliberately spoke more during these 3 drills because the energy was coming out of the team. So I used my voice and my communication as a tool to pump energy into the team when they needed it. But when they didn't need it early on, I sort of stayed quiet, which I think aligns to what you're saying, John. Almost the bad coaches will almost ride the wave of emotion that's in a gym and just sort of follow it, whereas the better coaches would actually almost do the opposite, where if the team's up and rolling, well then I'll just let them keep rolling. But as things change, well, that's when I need to change my behavior to either maintain or change that behavior in the athletes.
Yeah, that was something that came up in a few of the Volleyball Coaching Wizards interviews where we were talking about coaching personalities. And each coach has a baseline personality that they tend to abide by. Some coaches tend to sit on the bench. Other coaches tend to walk the sideline, and some variations in between. But the good ones know when they have to change and do something for the team. I think Jared Elliott famously a couple of years ago talked about this in terms of moving to sit down at the other end of the bench near the team. Because he normally sat near the score table like a lot of head coaches do, but he came to realize, okay, they need me down there more than they need me up by the score table. So the good coaches do. They pick up on those sorts of things and where do I need to be in position and body language and energy and vocal communication to influence my team positively.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, and when you do sit up there by the scorer's table, you are essentially at a disconnect, from your team, kind of from the court, from the end of the bench, and I think, and I'm talking with Daniel before, one of the best tools is to be able to take video and see yourself in a practice situation and see yourself in a match situation and watch body language and things like that. And I know, it's a little bit off of the punishment kind of topic, but, if you can get somebody, a peer, to come in and kind of evaluate you and what you do and how you go about it, I think there's such great resources, but also being willing to open up and, allow that in your gym. Because sometimes it is tough to hear, that critical feedback, but that's what we're giving as coaches to our players as well. So you have to be able to accept that and be able to change with it. But I think all coaches strive to be consistent, in the gym and not ride that roller coaster of emotions, but you do have to know when to kind of plug and play of, I've got to bring this up, or maybe it's my assistants that have to, raise a level of energy, or maybe a level of communication within the gym if things are dying down. We want our leaders on the team to recognize that as well and be able to help out with that. But again, I go back to, when you get a program that is, I'll say, kind of more of the player-driven side versus just everything, coming from the coach, that's when you have such good collaboration out there, and you're hopefully not as worried about the punishments. And I know we've got kind of positive punishment question up there versus maybe the negative there. So not sure where we want to go with that one.
Yeah, if you want to take that, we can do that. That's fine. I've got some ideas for moving forward, but it's here. So Michael, for those you can't see, which is basically everybody except us, Michael wants to know if the application of physical punishment in youth sports sets a bad, quote-unquote, model of what respectful relationships look and feel like, and he extended that to include positive punishment, such as the positive yelling that we were talking about before.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to kind of my statement of, the perception of yelling and that being negative. I really think that you've got to be aware of your tone, and you've got to be aware of your message. And then I think you have to have follow-up. It can't just be where I'm going to be one way in practice and maybe I'm yelling that positive encouragement, and then we're done for the day, done for practice, and we don't have that follow-up. And I think that's where something we've really strived a lot at Memphis is that follow-up after practice. And when we first started kind of talking about the positives and the negatives throughout a practice, and each player talks about their experiences that day, it's really interesting how when you talk about, hey, tell us some things that you did well today, that so many of the athletes automatically go to, well, I didn't do this well. And they tend to bring up the negative. And so I think that tells you a lot about, okay, hey, no, let's refocus. Give us something good that we can work with. We'll come back to things that we need to work on, but let's focus on the here and now and the positive aspect and be able to run with that. But I think, if things aren't going well for a player or for a team, there has to be that follow-up after practice as to, hey, do you understand where I'm coming from and maybe the point I'm trying to get across, because maybe it was lost in that moment. I think that's a big piece, is the follow-up.
I mean, I generally suggest that the physical punishment and the yelling and that sort of environment, I think you can get very, very short-term changes in behavior by doing that stuff, right? But you're not necessarily changing learning, and you're not changing, creating athlete engagement in the process. And so I tend to see coaches that coach with that sort of model they can be successful in the short term, because they can, I don't know, I sometimes even struggle with this concept that I can almost say bully people into behaving a certain way for a short period of time, but it doesn't last. I guess then almost mentally I then go, well, if I'm a coach and I only need a team to prepare for a season, should I just be a negative, monster and just scream at people and create some culture of fear? And obviously not is where I get back to. But then if winning's my only goal, is it okay to be a monster? John, you've got a little wry look on your face.
Well, I guess the question is, how short-term is short-term? So if you're thinking that yelling or punishment or whatever produces a short-term effect, is it today? Is it this week? Is it this season? Season could be a long time. I would tend to believe that people, after getting yelled at or punished for a couple of weeks, are probably going to get pretty sick of it and just tune it out or find adaptive behaviors to get around it.
I guess when I think about that, I automatically think of parenting and, like yelling at your kid for doing something wrong or sending them to their room or grounding them for the weekend. Has that come from coaching and sort of leadership, or has or has it come the other way?
I suspect it's been going on for as long as there have been parents. So maybe coaches reflect parenting.
Maybe. They say that coaches change when they have kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think, Daniel, we kind of hit on something the other day when we were chatting about the short term versus the long term. And the analogy I used was, when we talk about yelling and whether it's attention getting or if it goes negative, however you view it, it's really just trying to jumpstart an engine. And, you might get that spark and you might get that engine to start, but there is no fuel long term that's going to keep that car running and go in the right direction. So I think, again, for that day, for that drill, maybe there is that attention getting, hey, oh man, I got to really get back on track here, but it's not going to be a long-term fuel to continue doing that day to day, week by week, and throughout a season.
I've got a funny story on the failure of execution punishment. And that's, we had a player when I was coaching at Midwestern who was having problems staying out of the net when she was blocking. So the head coach decided anytime she got herself in the net, she was going to have to go touch 2 walls, or maybe it was just touch 1 wall and then come right back in. And she did it a lot. So apparently it became a habit for her to just automatically, go for a run every time she touched the net. So we went on and took the Buenos Aires with the team. And literally in the middle of playing a friendly match against San Lorenzo, she netted and took like a step and a half to go run and touch it. One of her teammates was like, "What are you doing?" So we have to be aware of the influence of these sorts of things along the way as well.
I remember one of the track and field athletes at pole vaulter I was working with, he was having trouble with balking as he was running in. So he'd run in and just sort of second guess himself and just bail out of the jump. And so him and his coach agreed that, how about we set up a fine system? He was pretty well paid and all that sort of thing. It's like, okay, let's do that. And so it worked really, talking about working really well for a short period of time. It probably worked for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes in terms of, every time he'd balk, he'd, literally get his wallet out and put a 50 down. And then after half an hour, he was like, you could see he was just like fed up. He was like, how much do I need to pay to get out of the session? He literally just put down $500 and walked out.
Yeah, not the response you want. But this whole thing, it brings up the question of, and we sort of touched on it at the beginning, punishment for failure of execution, punishment for failure to win or, to win a game or drill or whatever. But then also punishment as a behavioral modification sort of thing. And I don't think I've ever heard players ask to be punished for the first two, but I've definitely seen plenty of players who want to be punished, or maybe they don't want to be punished themselves, but they want there to be punishment for behavioral issues. Balls drop, people are late, whatever. When I coached in England, I think my second year there was a problem with tardiness in the players coming to practice. And the leadership said, hey, we want to do this. We want to do this physical punishment when people are late. And, okay, I work for them. This is a club situation, so technically I'm employed by the club and them, so I got to go along with it. I didn't really like it, and I hated having to enforce it, but I understood where they were coming from. And I've heard players, I've even had players tell me, yell at me. Nobody wants to get yelled at because it usually means you did something bad. So why would anybody want to be yelled at? So you can't take that suggestion on face value. There's something deeper to it. It usually means I know I need the attention, and sometimes I probably need a little bit of a kick in the rear end to get refocused. Okay, fine. We can find ways to do that. But how do we deal with this concept that the players feel like they need to be punished, or maybe not themselves, but somebody needs to be punished if there's a behavioral issue?
I think it's. Do you think it's just fundamentally easy to come up with a punishment for people being late rather than a reward for people being early? That sort of thing. Is the punishment thing just because it's easy to come up with a physical punishment or a consequence rather than creating a positive consequence for doing something right?
I would suggest that's probably part of it. I think there's also the idea that why should you be rewarded for doing the things that you're supposed to be doing? You know what I mean?
Okay. So, I don't know.
Your thoughts, Sean?
What pops to mind is, do you get a, get out of a drill free card because you are doing the right thing all the time versus, okay, you are being punished. But, I think Michael in his notes here and his questions of talking about so much of it is because that's what they've had before. That's what they've learned, from other coaches or what they've gone through. And so at the end of the day, I think we've probably all been around athletes or teams where, yes, you do have, like John used in terms of being tardy, and at some point the staff, the team, hey, these are our rules, this is what we're sticking with, and there is some sort of punishment, and you have to make those tough choices, and you hope, as we talked about, players being competitive. Well, if you're holding them out of a practice, holding them out of a match or a competition, like that should be punishment enough if they're continually breaking rules. And then you get to the point at some point where if it's happening over and over, you have to have that discussion as to this is probably not, the best place for you to be if you aren't willing to follow team rules and regulations that, have been set out for everybody to keep everybody kind of on a same playing field.
I'm just thinking about jail and punishment and crime and that sort of
Sean,
thing.
do you have any kind of set sort of... No, go ahead, Daniel. Go ahead.
No, you're right. I was just thinking that I don't get a reward for not murdering somebody every day. And I don't know. I don't get rewarded for, like you said, not speeding, but I do get punished if I do speed. And I don't know, maybe it's just a societal thing that we're used to being punished for doing things wrong rather than doing things right.
Yeah. Yeah.
John, what was
Sean,
your
the
question?
I was going to ask
missed
is, do you have a set of consequences? Yeah, no, well, the question is, do you have a set of consequences or punishments, or however you want to call it, for behavior that happens outside of the gym or failures of behavior? People show up late for an appointment with the trainers, or they're not going to class, or any number of possible issues.
Yes. Yeah, we have the team manual like most people do these days, and I think it is so tough now to detail out every single thing that could happen. And again, we go back to the negatives of why are we always thinking about what's going to go wrong versus what's going to go right. But I think you have to have some flexibility in there to be able to handle the situations, kind of case by case, because not everything is the same. But I've been in, programs where, yes, the coaching staff has laid down the punishment because, let's say, somebody was late. But then I've also been part of programs where the players, kind of like you were talking about, John, of coming to the staff and going, hey, enough's enough. Maybe you don't always see this, but, they're late, by 10 minutes every day when we said, hey, you got to be here 20 minutes early to get into the locker room and, be ready to go. And, so I've been in both spectrums there where it's come from the coaching staff, but then, from the players as well. And I think when the players are taking that accountability, again, you got to make sure that it's not directed and singling out one person. But if there is a consistent behavior that needs to be addressed, then yes, we've got the team rules that are in effect for that.
Yeah. When I was at Midwestern, one of the things that we kind of got around to doing for that sort of stuff was community service, basically, which obviously there's a punishment aspect to it, but it also has a positive sort of element. Because within the athletic department, we were competitive with the other teams in terms of trying to rack up community service hours, and obviously it's good for your program and your outreach and all that sort of stuff. So it gets me to thinking about, okay, you may need to do something to try to correct the behavior, but can you find a way to do it that's not just solely focused on that player or group of players, but can somehow enhance something, some aspect of your program, some aspect of their development as of individuals, so that it's just not some negative consequence that they can that happens once and has no really redeemable outcome beyond that.
Yeah. And you have to make that decision. Is it just going to be that player, or is it, team-based as well? One action affects, the actions of everyone, or the whole group.
Yeah, and that's always a difficult one. Do you hold out a player who missed practice because of something, because the rule says player who doesn't go to the last practice before a match is not allowed to play, but is your best player? If you don't have them, you're not going to win the match. And then that punishes everybody. It's like, okay. And that's where your team culture comes into the equation. What are your priorities as a group?
Yeah. Yeah. In one of the instances where the team just kind of goes, hey, enough's enough, we sat multiple players out. And quite frankly, the team had one of their best matches of the year, and they were able to rally around, and whether they were trying to prove a point to those players that were sitting out, or, they just decided, all right, hey, these are the people that are surrounding me that want to play hard and want to play together. And that, all came together in one point in one match.
Right.
It's interesting thinking about some of the punishment about sitting out and sort of community service. And from a scientific point of view, we fundamentally learn through reflection of some description. And I often feel like a lot of the punishments that we give people, whether we know it or not, actually are about giving them cause to reflect on their behavior or on their actions. And so I feel like a lot of things we intuitively do are designed to help the athlete reflect on their behavior, and whether that's, and often they seem to be often time-based. And I wonder if that's just because sort of practically we've seen it work, but I wonder if the underpinning behavior that's changing is the reflection that takes place during that time out. And I guess I sometimes think about when I think about that, and I think about the punishments of physical sort of work, I sometimes feel like that's sometimes almost an easy way out for athletes at times, that, I'll just run, and that almost makes, I can switch off my brain and I can actually just do this punishment easily. I can just sort of do my time without really reflecting or thinking about it. Whereas the challenge of actually sitting and, not being allowed to play is a really, really different thing. Yeah.
Not sure if we lost John there or not.
Yeah, we lost John. He didn't like my point.
Yeah, I think there is that almost escape mechanism when somebody is being punished of, okay, I can just take my mind completely off of, what I was doing poorly, but then it, I think, tends to shift towards the negative as to being punished now for not already performing well. And so then, you start adding all those negatives together, and it could get into a deeper hole for the athlete. But I do think that you see so much, whether it's professional sports and you watch other coaches, and so much as it is, how you were coached, what you see these days, and there's so many things to take in and learn from out there.
What do you think? I was thinking about that thing about, you said how, if one person gets punished, the whole team gets punished. If one person makes a mistake, then we all do the same punishment. Is that just come from a team building background, or is it about accountability, or is it just pure? Is it about turning athletes against one another? Do you almost remember where that's come from, or why you do that?
I don't think it's turning. I don't think most people would look at it as turning athletes against each other. I think you hit it kind of on the head with the accountability piece of wanting the team and the players to hold each other accountable and understand that, again, I think you have to have the analysis as to what's happened or what's gone wrong that we're getting to this point. Is it, a lack of execution, or, you're making errors on the court, or is this more of a behavioral thing, or something that's affecting the program culture? So I think everybody's going to evaluate that a little bit differently. I know coaches a lot of times in the beginning of a season will, utilize kind of a whole team, I guess, punishment, and we say conditioning because maybe they feel like the whole team, needs better work in that realm. So it's an easy out to just kind of go, okay, hey, we're going to run set of lines, or we're going to run stairs or something early in the season because, quite frankly, everybody could benefit from that.
Right. Sorry, I'm back.
You're back.
Completely lost my internet. Just crashed. Daniel, when we were talking about this topic, you brought out this idea of a spectrum related to coaching style, so like instruction versus guidance. Mm-hmm. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, essentially, so the spectrum of view is, I guess it can be coaching and it can also be learning at the same time, where an instructional style behavior that's built around sort of direct instruction and real sort of structure in your life can create very good short-term outcomes in terms of behavior, but there's a very big limitation on the learning that actually takes place. So the heavy instruction model gets very good short-term benefits, which is why we do it, because we see immediate change and therefore we think it's worked. But actually, in fact, it's got a very short learning sort of duration, and it's got a very poor transfer to any sort of other scenario. So it's almost a very scenario-based short-term model of teaching. And in the far end is then the athlete, sort of the ultimate athlete-led behavior, where the coach is a facilitator, there's actually no coach at all, and the athlete's guiding their entire own learning process, almost the sort of skateboarding analogy where kids will just be riding their skateboards around and teaching themselves stuff, and they'll just learn they'll create their own learning paradigm. They'll watch their own videos, they'll try their own tricks, and they'll sort of seek out their own thing. Where we try to land is somewhere in the middle, which we call guided discovery or facilitative coaching, where actually you're as a coach, you're guiding athletes through that search process that they would go to at this end of the spectrum. If we just leave athletes completely on their own, while it has very, very good long-term learning and very good transfer of skills, it can take a really long time because they almost don't know where to search. Like it's almost, you're sort of randomly looking for the answer, whereas in a guided model, as a coach, we have the experience to guide them to where the answers are, and that's sort of where we want to land as coaches, that we're guiding athletes through this process of discovery, this process of learning, that they're still in charge of it, but we're almost putting the bumpers up, so to speak, when we're bowling. We're just stopping any sort of waste of time or sort of any gutter balls. And I sometimes feel like the positivity and negativity stuff is around the same, whereas if you're negative, you can get a very good short-term behavior change, and you can get people to do things in a short period of time. Like my wife can yell at me and I'll do the dishes. But if she spends time explaining to me why that makes her upset, well, then maybe that'll change my behavior in the long term to actually change my behavior. Otherwise, every time the dishes are dirty, she has to yell at me. And it just creates this sort of cycle of me then not wanting to do it more and just waiting. I'm almost waiting for that negative feedback to change my behavior. Whereas a guided discovery model is actually about, talking to the athlete, understanding where they're coming from, what their challenges are, what they want to work on, and then building your structure around that.
Right.
I think, Daniel, with that, the guided principle, so often I think you see coaches that maybe lack the patience for that. And they want things to happen right now and be very, very quick. And that's where sometimes it reverts back to, the yelling, the negativity, those things, to try and get things done faster, and get those quicker results. But the long term is, I think, certainly much more functional with the guided.
It's so true that it's often because we mistake seeing that short-term performance as learning. And it's a really natural thing to do, to be like, oh, they fixed that problem. Good, let's move on. Whereas in fact, all you've done is just change that performance, and you haven't changed any of the underlying learning or behavior. So it's almost like it's almost what's the word? It's almost like a feel-good sort of short-term buzz that you're like, oh no, I fixed it, let's move on, and without really understanding the underlying principles behind it. And I so often hear that phrase, if we just got to get work done, we just got to get it done. And it's like, you realize you're actually wasting your time. You're actually you're not teaching anybody anything. You're feeling like you're changing things, but you're not. You're just, getting work done is actually wasting everybody's time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it was Wednesday. I was having a conversation that Mark Lebedeau was on with a couple others, and they were talking about the amount of time spent on things. And he referenced a conversation he had with a French coach, and they were talking about current training versus old training, and how they're spending basically half as much time on training now than used to be the case. And Mark's comment wasn't getting the same amount done. And the French coach was like, no, getting twice as much done, because you've got more people using modern training techniques, not the old, we're going to spend 6 hours in practice all day. And Marcus has said, he thinks back to when he was a player, and it's like, we would have 4-hour practices. He's like, I can't remember what we did. He's like, I know what we did, but I can't remember what we actually accomplished in all that time.
Yeah.
It's so funny. You even look across sports, and the amount of time that a session goes for is based purely on what's usual for that sport, rather than, I've never really heard a coach say, today we're going to achieve this, and once that's done, we're done. Mm-hmm. It's much more like, I have an hour. Okay, I've got 3 hours. I've got 4 hours. Well, then that's how long we're training for. It's like, especially coming from some of the real skill sports like your gymnastics and your diving and that sort of thing. It's like, how long's training? It's like 3 hours. Okay, or like you said, John, 4 hours. It's like, as opposed to having any other relationship than just time. Like, It seems like such a base, it seems like a not great thought out method of designing a training session.
It makes a certain amount of sense if you have limited numbers of sessions. If you only practice 2 times a week and you've got 2-hour blocks and those, okay, that's fine. But if you have more flexibility to be able to schedule as desirable, professional team, national team, to a degree, college teams, to a degree, in the NCAA, then it's what do you need to get done?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you look back, and over the years, I've adjusted how I coach and we train, and you pare back. I think a lot of people do as you go further into the season and your practices become shorter. And quite frankly, you look back sometimes and you go, hey, in that hour and a half, we got an awful lot accomplished, and it was good volleyball, whether it was training, competing, whatever it is. But hey, that was good start to finish, and it wasn't necessarily the players just counting down the minutes as to, okay, it's 2 hours in and 2.5 hours into the practice now. And so I think, there is something to be said for that. And I've been in, many different gyms and styles of training where, there was nothing that was timed. It was just, hey, these are the things we got to get accomplished today, and we're here until we're doing it, versus some gyms where we're only going to spend, 11 minutes on this drill and 7 on this and 20 on this. And, whether whether we've accomplished everything in that drill or not, we're still moving on. There's a time limit to it, and we're just going to move forward. So I think a lot of different rationales and different ways to set up your practices there. But I know, when we've pared down, we've had some really, really good practices because the athletes value that time and they know that there's not a lot of room for error.
Okay. We're coming up on an hour, so if you have any questions, for those of you in the audience, feel free to submit them. Is there anything that you guys talked about in your conversation leading into this that we haven't got into yet?
One thing I was thinking about, John, was the idea that, and we touched on it when we spoke with Alexis the other week, which is negativity it's actually about the perception of the receiver of the information rather than the delivery. And something that a coach delivers to an athlete can be negative to the athlete even though the coach doesn't think it is. And, and that could be as simple as, maybe like a score. Like I'm thinking about tests and that sort of thing. You get 95% and some people will be like, where'd I get my 5% wrong? And some people will be like, oh, good, I got 95% right. And I think sometimes when we think about negativity, we've got to think that it's not just what I as the coach perceive as negative or positive. It's actually more about what the athlete perceives as negative or positive. They can perceive me raising my voice as really negative. I can perceive it as I'm just giving encouragement, but it doesn't really matter what I think as the coach. It's much more about taking that time to check in with the athletes and making sure that they've perceived that in the way that I guess you wanted it to.
And I think it is sometimes tough for coaches to have that follow up and ask, the athletes as to, what are your thoughts? What did you feel out there today? And really get their opinions on things. Because I think so many times coaches get wrapped up into it's my way and this is how we do it. And it's just blinders on and we're moving this direction versus, having that discussion with the athlete.
Yeah. Actually, Michael, I think Michael has had to leave, but he actually left a thing in the chat about something that John Spera brought up that touches on what we were talking about before in terms of the team and players wanting to encourage punishment or something along those lines. And John is famous for not liking the whole accountability concept because he thinks, as Michael put it, gives permission for the most dysfunctional members of the team to ruin relationships. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Could you just elaborate, John? What are we referring to there?
So accountability amongst the members of the teams with each other, not necessarily with the coach, but basically, I guess you could kind of look at it as in terms of the players are free under a system of accountability to be critical of each other. They can't necessarily punish each other per se, but they can certainly have negative attitudes toward each other based on perceived lacks of whatever it is that somebody thinks is faulty.
I mean, I think so much of that stuff is around and I think some of the stuff we've talked about aligns with it, the aligning of expectations and the aligning of what's appropriate. And in terms of, I don't think you worked hard enough versus I think I worked hard enough. Like are different perceptions of what is hard work, what is being punctual, what does learning look like, what's a mistake in training actually mean. I think sometimes it's just the fact that if we have different expectations of what those things are, then that sort of drives that sort of almost that misalignment of expectations is what drives the friction. And then if we're then allowed to punish people because our expectations are unaligned, well, then the friction just gets worse and worse.
Yeah, I think it's interesting with the accountability piece and thinking about how that might open up somebody to potentially, teammate being negative and, as he put, ruin relationships. And you would hope that there's not, that team member that's their plan and that's what they're trying to do. Inadvertently, they may kind of go maybe potentially that route. And I think it is tough, especially, in sports today, to have, I guess maybe that good cop, bad cop, so to speak, within your team. And, is there that player or group of players? I can't put it out just on one person, but is there a group of players that can, maintain the order, I guess? So that's an interesting concept, certainly a lot more to go into there and think about.
Yeah. Yeah, and leadership plays a big factor in all that, and what does that look like in your team? And that's a whole other conversation. Yeah. We go hours on that topic by itself.
When it's good, it's great.
Yeah, exactly. Good leadership can make for a beautiful season. Anything else can make it a struggle.
Yep.
And winning is also a great way to paper over poor leadership as well.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Winning does mask stuff sometimes.
Yeah. All right. Well, we haven't had any additional questions. Any final thoughts from either of you?
I think, the thing I took away in all my conversations with Daniel, I've been very fortunate to be able to, lean on him and throw ideas out and have great conversations, is that, it is a learning experience for everybody, and you have to be willing to change. You have to be willing to adapt and, sometimes get out of your own coaching comfort zone and be able to experience and see things differently. And I think when you can rely on peers and, ask for help and have people kind of evaluate the way you're going about things, then that helps you grow as a coach. And, I know I've evolved over the years and certainly appreciate those former players, and then, also my peers that have been able to kind of help guide and shape my coaching career. But try to take things with you as much as you can and really, just keep building your brand and your portfolio as a coach.
Yeah, I think it sort of comes back to the self-analysis is so difficult but so important. And sometimes as a coach or as a scientist or whoever, we're really busy sort of in the moment, and we don't take that time to step back and either have somebody else evaluate us or reflect on our behaviors. And the more we can do that, the more we improve. Just as we'd ask our athletes to, we ask ourselves to, what did I do well today? What do I need to do differently tomorrow? What worked in today's session? What didn't? Because if we don't stop to reflect, we just keep making the same mistakes, and that makes us frustrated. That makes the athletes frustrated. And we just get in this loop of just, you start shifting blame to the wrong place, or you just start, you just make the same mistake over and over again. It's crazy that we don't take just a few minutes to be like, actually, even you even think about it, in this quarantine period, what did I do well yesterday? Well, I probably shouldn't have had a third coffee at, like 7 o'clock at night, but, I'm going to just do that differently tomorrow so that I get a better sleep tonight. Just really simple things about reflection and just reflecting on coaching and our behavior and becoming better as a result.
Yeah. Just bringing it all back to the punishment, I think you have to give a lot of thought to what exactly the punishment is for and what you're trying to accomplish with it, and whether there's a better way to do that, a more constructive way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, punishment is such an easy, I say easy solution. It's such a fallback solution, and without, like you said, John, probably thinking about it, it can have much bigger consequences than we perhaps realize.